There comes a point in life when you realize something uncomfortable, yet extremely real. The more you try to control everything, the more everything starts to slip out of your control. And this doesn't happen explosively. It's not a clear event. It's a silent accumulation, small delays, conversations that don't flow, decisions that seem right but don't bring peace, a constant feeling of strain, as if living has become too heavy. And at that point, almost everyone reacts the same way. They try harder. They get more organized. They demand more of themselves. You adjust plans, create strategies, seek answers, because we were taught to believe that taking action is always better than stopping, that doing something, anything, is safer than doing nothing. But there's a question that rarely comes up in this process. What if the problem isn't a lack of action? What if it's exactly the opposite? From an early age, we learn a simple logic. Problem means immediate action. If a relationship starts to fail, you try to talk more, explain more, fix more. If your career becomes uncertain, you pursue new goals, new paths, new possibilities. If an inner void arises, you try to fill it with activities, distractions, or new objectives. This logic creates a sense of control, and control brings relief, even if it's momentary relief, because the human mind has a deep need to feel in command, that there is a plan, that there is direction, that there is security. But this feeling may be one of the greatest illusions we hold throughout our lives. There's a part of your mind that can't stand the unknown. It needs quick answers. It needs clear direction. It needs to feel like everything is being guided. This part associates movement with safety, and that's why stopping seems dangerous. Staying silent seems like a waste of time. Not acting seems like weakness. Now, think honestly. How many times have you made decisions simply to avoid the feeling of uncertainty? How many times have you kept yourself busy, not because it was necessary, but because the emptiness bothered you? How many times have you acted too quickly, not because it was the best path, but because stopping was uncomfortable? There's something subtle happening in this behavior. When you act solely to alleviate anxiety, you're not solving the problem. You're only creating the feeling that you are solving it. And this has a profound effect, because you start to confuse movement with progress. You may be doing many things, you may be busy all the time, you may be making progress externally, but internally, something isn't keeping up with that movement. There's a slight but constant tension, a discomfort that's hard to explain, a feeling that something isn't quite aligned, and it is precisely at this point that most people get lost, because outwardly, everything may seem right. Work is happening, routines are functioning, plans are being executed, but internally there is a noise, an unease that doesn't go away. And then a question arises that few dare to ponder for long. If you're doing everything you should be doing, why isn't it bringing clarity? Perhaps because not everything in life responds to the logic of direct effort. There is a deeper dimension within you that doesn't function based on pressure, haste, or control. And when you try to impose your will on that dimension, something begins to get stuck. Not in an obvious way, not as a visible mistake, but as a silent resistance. You start to feel tired of things that used to be natural. You lose interest in paths that once seemed right. You find it difficult to maintain the same level of energy, and yet you keep trying, because the automated response is always the same. I need to try harder. But what if that's exactly the mistake? There is an important idea within depth psychology. The human mind is not just rational. There is a deeper, less controllable part that perceives things that consciousness cannot immediately organize. This part does not speak with direct logic. It manifests itself through sensations, intuitions, and subtle changes in your internal state. And when you ignore it for long enough, the disconnect begins to grow. You keep doing what you've always done. You keep following the plan. You keep insisting on the same direction. But little by little, you lose the sense of purpose. This creates a paradox that's hard to accept. You're doing everything right, but something is still wrong. And then an even more common behavior emerges. You try to compensate for that feeling with more action, more goals, more effort, more control. It's like trying to see the bottom of a lake while you keep agitating the water. No matter how much you look, no matter how hard you try, you won't see clearly. Because the problem isn't in your ability to see, it's in the constant movement that prevents clarity. Now think about your own life. How many decisions have you made on impulse, wanting to resolve things quickly? How many times have you filled the silence with action? How many times have you avoided stopping, not because you couldn't, but because you didn't want to deal with what might arise? There's a silent fear that guides many of these choices, the fear of realizing that perhaps you're following a path that isn't yours. Because if that's true, continuing to act as you are seems more comfortable than facing the need to change. But this comfort is temporary, and the cost comes later. It manifests as wear and tear, as constant doubt, as a life that seems full on the outside but empty on the inside. And then you get into a cycle that's hard to recognize. The more disconnected you feel, the more you try to compensate with action. The more you try to compensate, the further you get from yourself. On the outside, it looks like productivity, but on the inside, it's just escapism. This leads to a direct and uncomfortable reflection. Not every movement is progress. Not every action is necessary. And at times, continuing to insist may be exactly what is distancing you from what you truly need. There's something inside you that doesn't respond to force. It doesn't respond to demands. It doesn't respond to excessive control. And when you ignore it long enough, life starts sending signals. At first, they are small, almost imperceptible, easy to ignore. A slight tiredness, a doubt that comes and goes, a feeling that something isn't quite right. But these signs raise a question that most people avoid. If the path you're following demands more and more effort and gives you less and less clarity, why do you keep insisting on it? And perhaps the most important question isn't what you should do next, but rather, what you need to stop forcing is that life itself starts slowing everything down for you. There is a silent belief that guides the lives of many people without them realizing it. The idea that when faced with any problem, one must act immediately, as if action were always the right answer, as if stopping were a risk. If something starts to go wrong in a relationship, the automatic reaction is to try to fix it, to talk more, explain more, insist more. If one's career becomes uncertain, there's an urgency to decide quickly, change direction, create new plans. If an internal discomfort arises, the first attempt is to fill it with some activity, any activity that distracts. Ultimately, this rarely has anything to do with solving the problem. It has to do with alleviating the feeling of insecurity. The human mind creates a very strong association between action and security. When you do something, even if it's not the best choice, you feel like you're in control. And feeling in control brings relief, even if it's temporary. But this relief is short-lived, because it doesn't solve the root cause. It only silences the discomfort for a few moments. There is a profound observation that explains this behavior. People are capable of doing almost anything to avoid facing what they truly feel inside. This doesn't only happen in extreme situations. It happens in the small decisions of everyday life. Imagine someone who begins to feel a void in their life. Instead of stopping to understand this void, this person decides to fill every space in their day. A full schedule, constant commitments, new projects, new goals. It seems like discipline, it seems like productivity. But in reality, it's a way to avoid silence. I knew a person named Sophia who lived exactly like that. Sophia was admired by everyone. Always busy, always energetic, always with new plans. If something wasn't going well at work, she quickly created a new goal. If she felt an inner discomfort, she would sign up for a course, organize a trip, or start a new project. From the outside, everything seemed organized. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But in a long late-night conversation, she said something that completely changed how I viewed that routine. She confessed that she didn't like empty moments. She said that when there was nothing to do, a strange feeling arose, difficult to explain, a slight but constant restlessness. And to avoid feeling that, she was always looking for something new to occupy her mind. Sophia was no exception. She was a common example. Many people live like this, not because they need to, but because constant movement gives a sense of security. The ego believes that if you stop, everything could get out of control, so it pushes the person forward all the time. But there's a problem with that logic. Not every movement signifies progress. Sometimes you're moving a lot, but just spinning in the same place. Have you ever spent days completing tasks, fulfilling obligations, making decisions, and in the end felt like you hadn't made any progress? As if you were busy but not really advancing? This happens because action, when born from anxiety or fear, does not bring clarity. It only maintains the movement. There's a simple metaphor that helps illustrate this. Imagine a deep lake. If the surface is turbulent, you can't see the bottom. No matter how hard you try to look, the image remains distorted. Now imagine that the water begins to calm down. Gradually, everything becomes clearer. You begin to see what was previously hidden. The mind works the same way. When you constantly act to avoid discomfort, you keep your mind in a state of agitation. And in that state, it's very difficult to perceive what's really happening inside you. This explains why so many people do so much, but understand so little about themselves. There is an important difference between acting with clarity and acting to avoid discomfort. The first provides direction, the second creates stress. How can we perceive this difference in everyday life? There's a simple sign. When action stems from clarity, It brings a sense of stability, even if the path is challenging. When it stems from anxiety, it comes with haste, tension, and a need to resolve everything quickly. Now think about the last important decisions you made. Did they come from a state of calm or urgency? This is a question that many people avoid answering honestly, because the truth is that most decisions aren't made at the right time. They're made when the discomfort becomes unbearable. There is a deep unease in not knowing, in not having an immediate answer, in not having complete control of the situation, and it is this unease that leads people to act before they understand. But acting before understanding usually leads to consequences that require further action later, and so a cycle begins. You solve one problem, but create another. You make a decision, but need to correct it later. You move forward, but soon realize you need to adjust everything again. And the most curious thing is that, even noticing this pattern, many people continue to repeat it. Because stopping seems harder than continuing. There's a silent fear behind it. The fear of stopping and realizing that maybe you're going in the wrong direction. Because if that's true, you'll have to reconsider your choices, review your path, maybe start over. And that's scary. So it's easier to stay busy, easier to keep doing things, easier to maintain a sense of control, even if it's not real. But life doesn't respond well to that kind of control. There are times when continuing to act doesn't solve anything. It only pushes you further away from what needs to be understood. And it is at this point that something begins to change. When you stop using action as a way to protect yourself, space opens up. Space to observe, space to feel, space to notice things that previously went unnoticed. This space may feel uncomfortable at first, because it reveals truths that were hidden by constant movement. But it is also in this space that something rare emerges. Clarity. Not the immediate clarity that the ego desires, but a deeper understanding that emerges when you're not constantly trying to force answers. And perhaps here lies an important shift in perspective. Security doesn't necessarily come from controlling everything. It can come from the ability to stop, observe, and understand before acting. The problem was never the action itself. The problem is when the action becomes an escape. And when you start to realize this, a new question naturally arises. If constantly taking action doesn't solve anything, then why at certain points in life, even when you keep trying, does it seem like everything starts to lose its power? Why does something that once flowed naturally begin to feel heavy, slow, and difficult, as if something invisible is gradually draining its energy? There's a very specific moment when something changes inside you, but almost no one notices it immediately. It's not an obvious mistake. It's not a clear flaw. It's more subtle. What once flowed smoothly begins to require effort. What once seemed natural starts to feel burdensome, and yet outwardly everything remains the same. And then you do what you've always done. You try harder. But here's a point that few people can clearly see. Not every roadblock means you need to persevere. In some cases, it means exactly the opposite. There is an important concept within depth psychology. The human mind doesn't function solely through logic and conscious decision-making. There is an internal energy that guides our interests, our motivation, and our sense of direction. This energy is not constant. It moves. It appears in certain ways and disappears from others. Now think carefully. What happens when that energy starts to disappear precisely from the thing you insist on the most? Most people interpret this in the most common way possible: lack of discipline, lack of focus, lack of willpower. But this interpretation could be completely wrong. What if the power loss isn't your fault? What if it's a sign? Imagine someone who chose a career based on external expectations. At first, everything works. There's motivation, recognition, and advancement. The person feels they're on the right track, but over time something starts to change. Energy decreases, interest fades, tasks become more burdensome. This person can follow two paths. Either they stop to observe what is happening, or they try to compensate with more effort. Most choose to persist. You work harder, you demand more of yourself, you take on more responsibilities, and for a while this sustains the appearance of progress. But there is a limit that cannot be crossed without consequences. And then a question arises that can no longer be ignored. Why is it that even though I'm doing more than before, it seems like I'm making less progress? This is the point at which the internal conflict begins to appear more clearly. According to Jung's view, the human mind seeks balance. When you stray from what truly makes sense to you, something inside begins to react. Not with clear words, but with signs: lack of energy, loss of enthusiasm, feeling of heaviness. And here's something fundamental. This energy doesn't disappear randomly, it moves. If it ceases to exist in one way, it begins to emerge in another. Have you ever noticed that even when you're tired of certain things, you still feel curious about completely different ones? It's as if a part of you is trying to draw your attention to something new. This doesn't happen by chance. But there's a problem. The ego doesn't like to change direction. It clings to what has already been built, to what is already known, to what seems safe. So he insists. And the more you insist, the more you come into conflict with that internal energy. This conflict doesn't begin intensely. It appears subtly, a slight tiredness, a difficulty in maintaining the pace, a procrastination that didn't exist before, and then a pattern breaks. You start to realize it's not just discouragement, it's not just laziness, something different is happening, but even so you keep trying. Why? Because stopping means facing an uncomfortable possibility, the possibility of being on the wrong path, and that requires courage. So the mind creates justifications. I just need to try harder. I need more discipline. I need to keep going. But there's an important reversal here. What if insisting is exactly what's wearing you down? Imagine rowing a boat on a river. As long as there's water, the effort makes sense. You row and the boat moves forward. Now imagine that the river begins to dry up. You continue rowing with the same force, but the boat doesn't move. The problem isn't the effort, it's the context. And yet, many people continue rowing. Now stop for a moment. In what area of your life do you feel you are putting in the effort but not making progress? This question is uncomfortable because it shifts the focus. It removes responsibility solely from the effort and places attention on the direction. In common logic, difficulty means you need to try harder, but there's another possible interpretation. Constant difficulty can mean misalignment, and that's not easy to accept. Because if that's true, you need to reconsider your choices, revisit your path, maybe change direction completely, and that generates fear. But there is an important difference that few people are able to perceive. There are difficulties that make you grow, and there are difficulties that only wear you down. The first comes with meaning. There is effort, but there is also energy. There is challenge, but there is also a sense that this matters. The second one is different. There is effort, but no energy. There is action, but no clarity. There is movement, but no direction. And the more you ignore it, the more evident the signs become. First comes tiredness, then loss of interest, then a constant feeling of heaviness. In many cases, this evolves into anxiety, exhaustion, or more intense blockages. This doesn't happen because you failed. It happens because you persisted beyond the point where you should have stopped to observe. And here an important shift in perspective emerges. Maybe life isn't holding you back. Maybe it's protecting you, because if that energy continued to flow in the wrong direction, you could advance much further without realizing you were moving further away from yourself. And the further you went, the harder it would be to come back. So instead of interpreting energy loss as a problem, there is another way to look at it. It could be a smart limit, a type of break that prevents you from continuing with something that no longer makes sense. But this raises an even deeper question. If the signs are so clear, why do so many people ignore them for so long? Why do they keep insisting until life has to intervene more forcefully? And what happens when these signs stop being subtle and become impossible to ignore? There's a pattern that repeats itself more often than people realize, but almost no one recognizes it while it's happening. Life rarely interrupts someone abruptly right at the beginning. Before that, it sends small, almost silent signals that go unnoticed or are ignored. It all starts subtly, a tiredness that wasn't there before, a lack of interest in something that once seemed important, a feeling of disconnection that's hard to explain. It's not intense enough to cause immediate concern. It doesn't stop you from continuing, just bothers you subtly, and precisely because it is subtle, it is ignored. Have you ever noticed how the first signs never seem urgent? They don't disrupt the functioning of life. You can still work, maintain your routine, converse normally. So the mind interprets it as something fleeting, something that doesn't deserve attention. And so you continue. Days go by, weeks go by, months go by, and that feeling that was once light begins to repeat itself more frequently. It's not constant, but it appears more often. And even so, the automatic response is still the same. This too shall pass. I just need to keep going. There is an important piece of data that helps to understand this behavior. According to the World Health Organization, burnout does not appear suddenly. It is the result of a gradual accumulation of stress and wear and tear over time. In other words, before any collapse, there are clear signs that could have been noticed, but they rarely are. Why? Because the ego always offers a convenient explanation. I'm just tired. It's just a phase. Everyone goes through it. I need to be stronger. I need to keep going. These justifications seem rational. They allow you to move forward without having to question anything. They avoid the need to stop. But there is a silent cost. I remember a story that sums up this process well. A man commented that he worked in the same field for almost a decade. In the early years, everything seemed right. He grew, gained recognition, and built stability. But after a while, he began to feel something different. It wasn't a crisis. It was just a heaviness upon waking, a lack of enthusiasm, a feeling that he needed to force himself to keep up the pace. He interpreted it in the most common way possible, tiredness. So he decided to react. He worked harder. He dedicated himself more. He tried to compensate for that feeling with effort. For a while, it worked, or at least it seemed to work. But gradually, other signs appeared. Difficulty sleeping, constant irritability, lack of concentration, and yet, he continued, until the point where the body stopped responding. He was forced to stop, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't continue. And when he looked back, he realized something had always been there. The signs didn't appear suddenly. They had been there for a long time. They had simply been ignored. This story is not uncommon. It happens every day. There's a simple way to understand this process. Imagine a car's dashboard. When something starts to go wrong with the engine, a light comes on. At first, nothing changes drastically. The car continues to run. You can still drive. And it is precisely at this moment that the decision is made. Do you stop and check what's happening, or do you ignore it and keep driving? If you ignore it, the car doesn't stop immediately. It keeps running for a while, but the problem grows, and sooner or later, something bigger happens. The human mind and body function in a similar way. At first, the sign is just a mild discomfort. Then it becomes more frequent, then more intense. And if it is still ignored, it turns into something impossible to avoid. What was once just an internal feeling can become a real blockage. What was once a doubt can turn into a crisis. What was once mild tiredness can become profound exhaustion. And this raises an inevitable question. Why wait until it gets to that point? Because there is something that binds people to the paths they have already built. The more time you invest in something, the harder it becomes to question it. There's a sense of loss involved, as if stopping would mean wasting everything that's been done up to that point. Then the person continues, even when you realize something isn't right, even when you feel the energy isn't the same, even when you recognize deep down that there's a misalignment, and this creates a constant internal conflict. Part of you notices the signs, another part insists on ignoring them, and the longer this conflict continues, the more it begins to manifest itself in other ways, not just as a thought, but as a bodily reaction. Studies show that prolonged stress can generate real physical symptoms: insomnia, muscle pain, constant fatigue, digestive problems. In other words, what begins as emotional discomfort can turn into a concrete physical problem. This completely changes the way you look at the situation. The body isn't failing, it's reacting. He's trying to get your attention in a way that you can't ignore. But even so, many people continue to resist until something bigger happens. It could be the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, an emotional breakdown, a moment when continuing is no longer an option, and at that moment, the feeling is one of chaos. It seems like everything has spiraled out of control. It seems like something has been destroyed. But there is another way to look at it. What if this moment isn't just a loss? What if it's a correction? Because when the initial signs are ignored, life has no other option but to intensify the message. What was once a mild warning becomes a clear interruption. And this isn't done to punish you. It's done to stop you from continuing with something that isn't working. But there's a detail that most people only notice later. Many of these interruptions over time prove to be necessary. People who lose their jobs end up finding something more aligned. Relationships that end open up space for a deeper understanding of oneself. Paths that failed end up redirecting to something that was not previously visible. But that only becomes clear later. Right now, everything seems like just loss, and this leads to an important reflection. If the signs have been there from the beginning, what exactly is preventing you from listening before the situation needs to reach this level? Perhaps the answer lies not in the lack of signs. Perhaps it lies in the difficulty of stopping and listening. Because listening requires something most people avoid: pausing, observing, questioning. And this opens up a new possibility. Perhaps you don't need to wait for something big to fall apart to change direction. Perhaps you can begin to realize it now. But this raises an even deeper question. If life at times needs to dismantle what is out of alignment, what happens when what seemed secure begins to disappear completely? There comes a point in life when everything that seemed solid begins to lose its shape, and it never happens the way you imagined. There's no clear warning, no amount of emotional preparation. It just happens. A job ends, a relationship falls apart. A plan built over years simply stops working. And at that moment, the feeling is not one of learning. It's one of loss. The mind tries to react quickly. It seeks explanations, creates hypotheses, tries to find the mistake. Where did everything go wrong? What could have been done differently? There is an urgent need to make sense of what happened, as if understanding were enough to recover what was lost. But there is something that is rarely considered at this time. Not every collapse is a mistake. For those accustomed to being in control, any disruption seems like failure. It seems like a sign that something was done poorly. But there is another possibility, harder to accept. Some structures don't break down because they failed. They break down because they shouldn't have continued to exist in the way they were. Now stop for a moment and think. How many times have you kept something going simply because you had already invested too much time to give up? This is one of the most dangerous aspects. The more you build something, the harder it becomes to question it. There's a silent attachment to the effort already made, a feeling that stopping would mean losing everything. So you continue, even when you feel something isn't right, even when the energy isn't the same anymore. Even when you realize you're just holding on to something that can no longer sustain itself. But no structure remains intact forever when misalignment exists. At first, small cracks appear, details that seem insignificant, minor discomforts, minor conflicts, minor doubts, and you ignore it. Then these cracks widen. They begin to affect more areas of your life. The effort to keep everything running increases. The strain intensifies, and yet you continue, until a point is reached where it is no longer sustainable. And then the collapse happens. This is a difficult time to go through because it shatters not only the external situation, but also the image you had of yourself. What you believed to be your path, your identity, your direction, ceases to exist in the way it did before, and that creates a void. Have you ever noticed how this emptiness is one of the most uncomfortable feelings there is? Not because it's dangerous, but because it doesn't offer immediate answers. It doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't show you the next step. And the mind tries to escape from that, try to rebuild quickly, create a new plan, replace what was lost as soon as possible. But here's the point that changes everything. What if this emptiness isn't a problem? What if it's necessary? Because while you try to fill that void immediately, you're still operating with the same logic that brought you there, the logic of avoiding discomfort at all costs. But when you allow that space to exist, something different begins to happen. At first it seems like just silence, confusion, a lack of direction. But little by little, small changes emerge. You begin to notice things that previously went unnoticed, interests that were ignored, ideas that were never considered, feelings that had no space to exist. And then something curious happens. Events begin to unfold unexpectedly. Casual conversation that brings a new perspective, information that appears at the exact moment you needed to reflect on something. A person who enters your life unplanned, but who changes the way you see your own situation. At first, it seems like a coincidence. But when these events start to repeat themselves, something changes in the way you interpret them. You start to notice patterns. Carl Jung called this synchronicity. Events that don't have a direct causal relationship, but that carry meaning when they happen at specific moments in life. You've probably experienced something like this before. He considered changing direction and, without looking for it, found exactly the kind of information he needed. He questioned an important choice, and at the same time situations arose that showed him a different path. Taken separately, these events seem random, but when they happen in sequence, they begin to look like they are orchestrated. And that raises an interesting question. Is all this just a coincidence, or is there something more going on? The answer doesn't need to be absolute to have value. What matters is the effect. Because when you start to notice these patterns, something changes inside you. The feeling of being completely lost begins to diminish. A realization emerges that, even without total control, there is movement happening. And this movement does not respond to haste. It doesn't appear when you demand immediate answers. It appears when you observe. This requires something that most people are not used to doing: patience. Because this type of reorganization doesn't follow the rhythm of anxiety. It doesn't follow the rhythm of fear. It doesn't follow the rhythm of urgency. It follows a different rhythm, and that can be uncomfortable because it means walking without guarantees. It means moving forward without complete certainty. It means accepting that you won't understand everything at first. But there is an important difference here. You may not have complete control, but you're starting to get a sense of direction. And this direction doesn't emerge as a closed plan. It appears in small openings, an opportunity you weren't looking for, an interest that's starting to grow, a path that feels easier even though it's unfamiliar. These signs are different. They don't demand that you force it. They don't demand that you fight against yourself. They simply appear, and that changes the way you act. Instead of trying to control everything, you start responding to what arises. Instead of insisting on a fixed path, you start to adjust. And gradually, a new structure begins to form, not based solely on external logic, but on something more aligned with who you truly are. But this leads to an inevitable question. If this new path doesn't come with guarantees, if it doesn't offer complete control, how can you know if you're really going in the right direction? Because recognizing signs is one thing, trusting them is a completely different matter. And it is precisely here that many people begin to doubt themselves again. There comes a moment after everything you've been through when something changes silently but definitively. It's not a visible achievement. It's not a result you can show to others. It's not something you can easily explain. It's an internal change. After trying to control insisting, getting frustrated, ignoring signs, being interrupted, and needing to start over, you begin to notice something different. It's not intense enthusiasm. It's not absolute certainty. It's simpler and at the same time deeper. It is peace, but not a superficial peace, one that depends on everything being perfect. It's a calmness that exists even when there are still doubts, even when the path isn't entirely clear, even when life continues to demand decisions. That's the difference. Before, uncertainty generated anxiety. Now it generates presence. Before, the unknown seemed like a threat. Now it may simply be part of the journey. And this doesn't happen because you solved everything. It happens because you stopped fighting against yourself. For a long time, you believed that being on the right track meant having external proof. Results, recognition, stability, validation. But experience shows otherwise. The most reliable signal is not outside. He appears inside. You've felt this at some point, maybe briefly. That feeling that, even without having all the answers, something seems to fit. As if you're no longer forcing yourself to be someone you're not. This is rare, and when it happens, it changes the way you see everything. But there is an important point that needs to be understood. This state does not mean an absence of challenges. Your life doesn't become perfect. Problems continue to exist. Uncertainties continue to arise. What changes is how you react to all of this. Before, every difficulty created tension. Now it creates reflection. Before, every doubt demanded an immediate answer. Now it can be observed calmly. Before, any delay seemed like a mistake. Now it can simply be part of the process. This happens because you stopped trying to control every detail. And when that need diminishes, something deeper begins to take shape. But understanding this is not enough. If you don't put that understanding into practice, everything will revert to the previous pattern, so there is a direct path you can start applying. First, create real breaks in your day. It's not just about stopping work, it's about stopping automatic reactions. Take a few minutes without stimuli, no cell phone, no distractions, no trying to solve anything. Just observe what's happening inside you. At first it might seem strange, it might even cause discomfort, but it's in this space that you begin to notice signs that previously went unnoticed. Second, observe your energy honestly. Pay attention to what energizes you and what drains you. Not just what seems right, but what you truly feel. There are activities that require effort but bring meaning, and there are others that, even though they are easier, drain you. This difference is fundamental. Third, question the origin of your decisions. Before acting, ask yourself a simple question. Am I doing this for clarity or out of fear? Am I choosing this because it makes sense or because I'm avoiding something? This question, when asked honestly, completely changes the quality of your choices. Fourth, reduce the need for absolute control. You don't need to know everything to take the next step. You just need enough clarity to act now. The rest will reveal itself along the way. Life doesn't work like a complete plan. It works like a sequence of discoveries. Fifth, learn to recognize subtle signs. Not everything comes directly. Sometimes a conversation, an idea, or a situation brings an insight you wouldn't have planned. It's not about seeing meaning in everything, but about noticing what repeats itself and what consistently catches your attention. Sixth, respect the time it takes for the process to take. Most people get lost because they try to rush something that needs to mature. Not every answer comes quickly. Not every decision needs to be immediate. Some things only become clear when you allow them to develop. And lastly, be honest with yourself. No automatic excuses. No ignoring what you've already noticed. There's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to admit it. These steps seem simple, but they are profound. And when you start applying them, something changes gradually, but consistently. You stop acting impulsively and start acting consciously. You stop running away from discomfort and begin to understand what it's trying to show you. You stop forcing answers and start allowing them to emerge. And with time, a certain realization becomes inevitable. You never had to control everything like you imagined. What you needed was to learn how to listen. And perhaps there is a question now that deserves your attention. In what area of your life are you still persisting, even though you feel that something is no longer aligned? This answer may not be easy, but it is important. If this content resonated with you, there's something simple you can do right now. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring this type of reflection in more depth. Like the video so that more people can access this content. And if you want, share any of your experiences in the comments. It can be something you're experiencing now or something you have already experienced. And if you prefer, you can do it anonymously, because often when you put your experiences into words, you begin to understand your own journey better. And at the same time, you can help someone who is going through the same process. And remember something essential. The turning point in your life doesn't always happen when you force everything to work out. Sometimes it happens the moment you stop, listen, and realize that the path has always been there, waiting for you to trust enough to follow it.